Why do you still flinch a little every time someone offers to help you, even when you're drowning and desperately need it? Why does asking for support feel almost embarrassing, like you're confessing some kind of personal failure instead of just asking a normal, reasonable question? And why, even when everything in your life looks calm from the outside, does some quiet part of you still feel like you have to keep one eye open just in case? If you grow up in the 1970s, none of this reaction is random, and it isn't really about the favor itself, or the calm surroundings, or the person standing in front of you. It might be the echo of a childhood that quietly trained you, without anyone ever saying it out loud, to expect that no one was coming, and that the only person you could fully count on, in the end, was yourself. That feeling didn't disappear when you grew up and built a life, a career, and relationships of your own. It simply went underground, where it has spent decades quietly shaping the way you handle stress, the way you love people, and even the way you relate to your own emotions when no one else is watching. And the truth is, this pattern runs far deeper than most people who actually lived through it ever realize, because it rarely looks like a wound. It usually just looks like personality. Psychologists and sociologists sometimes use the term latchkey generation to describe children who came home to an empty house, let themselves in with a key hanging on a string around their neck, and figured out dinner, homework, and the long, quiet hours until bedtime entirely on their own. This wasn't a rare or unusual situation if you were a kid in the 1970s. It was quickly becoming the new normal. As more mothers entered the workforce than in any previous decade, as new no-fault divorce laws spread rapidly across the country and divorce rates climbed to levels nobody had seen before, and as an oil crisis and runaway inflation made nearly every household feel a little less financially secure than it had felt just a few years earlier. Layer on top of that a cultural moment defined by a president resigning in disgrace, a deeply unpopular war finally ending, and gas lines stretching down entire city blocks, and you start to get a picture of a childhood spent absorbing a quiet, constant hum of adult uncertainty in the background of everyday life. Even something as simple as the evening news looked different during this decade, often arriving into the living room with grim footage and serious adult faces, giving children a front-row seat to a world that frequently seemed to be teetering, even when their own street looked completely peaceful. In simple terms, this means you may have learned at a very young age that the adults around you were busy, stretched thin, distracted, or simply unavailable for long stretches of the day, and that real survival meant learning to depend on yourself before you ever learned to depend on anyone else. That isn't a flaw in your character, and it was never a sign that something was wrong with you or your family. It was an adaptation, a clever and quietly resourceful way your young mind found to feel a sense of control and safety inside a world that often felt unsupervised, financially uncertain, and a little unpredictable. And if any part of this is sounding familiar, you might be living with the lingering effects of it right now, in ways you've never fully connected back to those long afternoons alone in the house. What's interesting is that this kind of early conditioning almost never shows up as a single, easy-to-spot trait. Instead, it spreads quietly into several different corners of who you are, often disguised as personality quirks, work habits, or relationship patterns, rather than personal history. In this video, we're going to walk through 6 psychological signs that tend to show up in people who grew up during the 1970s, signs that usually go completely unnoticed because they look like strengths, habits, or simply the way you've always been, rather than something with a clear origin story.
Some of these are going to feel obvious almost the moment we name them, and you'll probably nod along without even meaning to. Others are quieter, harder to spot, and tied to parts of yourself you may have never thought to question before now, things you've never once connected back to your childhood. Stay with us until the end, because the final sign tends to be the one that explains the most about why certain relationships or certain situations feel harder for you than they probably should, even when everything looks fine on paper. Let's start with something that might feel less like an old wound and more like a quiet superpower you've carried with you for your entire life. Sign 1. An unusually comfortable relationship with solitude. If you grew up in the 1970s, there's a good chance you became remarkably comfortable being alone long before most adults today would consider that a normal thing for a young child to handle without complaint. Without constant access to the internet, streaming shows, or a phone glowing in your pocket, and often with parents who were working, exhausted, or simply elsewhere for large parts of the day, you had to build your own entertainment out of whatever happened to be in front of you, whether that was an empty backyard, a stack of comic books, or a bike with absolutely nowhere in particular to go. Psychologically, this kind of unstructured, self-directed play is exactly what helps a child develop a strong internal world, the ability to self-soothe, imagine, and stay genuinely occupied without needing another person to manage their mood or fill their time for them. You might remember spending entire afternoons constructing elaborate forts out of couch cushions and old blankets, inventing complicated games with rules only you and maybe one other kid on the block ever fully understood, or losing yourself in a book for hours at a stretch. And somewhere inside those quiet, unsupervised hours, you got remarkably good at filling your own silence. The flip side is that this skill, while genuinely valuable and even a little admirable, can quietly turn into a strong preference for solitude, even in moments when real connection with another person is exactly what you need, because some part of you learned very early that your own company was simply the most reliable company available to you. You may even notice, as an adult, that you actually start to feel a little restless or drained after too much social time, not because you dislike the people you're with, but because solitude has always been your default setting for recovering and feeling like yourself again. But while this comfort with being alone looks peaceful on the surface, it's closely connected to something with a much sharper edge underneath it, a deep, almost reflexive instinct to handle absolutely everything yourself, even when that instinct quietly works against you. Sign 2. A reflex to handle everything yourself. Growing up in the 1970s often meant carrying real, tangible responsibility at a surprisingly young age, whether that was making your own dinner most nights, walking yourself to and from school in any weather, or managing a minor scrape, conflict, or small crisis without an adult immediately stepping in to take over for you. From a psychological standpoint, this kind of early competence sends a powerful, lasting message to a developing nervous system, and that message is essentially this: being capable equals being safe, and if you can't manage something completely on your own, there's a real chance it simply won't get done at all. As an adult, this often shows up as a near-constant difficulty delegating tasks at work or at home, a tendency to quietly take on far more responsibility than you were ever actually asked to carry, and a low-grade unease whenever someone else is handling something that directly affects your life, even when that person is perfectly capable of doing it well. Think about the last time a coworker offered to take a task off your plate, or a partner offered to handle a problem on your behalf, and notice honestly whether your first instinct was genuine relief, or whether it was a quiet, almost automatic urge to double-check their work, take it back, or simply redo it yourself afterward. This pattern can even show up in smaller, almost invisible ways, like feeling oddly uncomfortable letting a friend pay for dinner, or insisting on driving everywhere yourself because being a passenger feels strangely vulnerable. It can even show up in how you handle your own health, putting off a doctor's visit far longer than you should, or pushing through an illness at work because stopping to rest feels, on some level, like an indulgence you haven't quite earned. This deep, well-practiced instinct to do everything alone eventually created another, more painful pattern underneath it, an almost physical resistance to ever directly asking another person for help, even in moments when help is exactly what would make your life noticeably easier. Sign 3. Asking for help feels like a personal failure.
When a child learns, again and again, that no one is consistently available to step in and help, Asking for support starts to become emotionally linked with disappointment, rejection, or simple vulnerability, and quietly avoiding that ask becomes a reliable way of protecting yourself from being let down one more time. That protective strategy made a lot of sense for a kid managing an empty house and an unpredictable schedule, but it tends to linger long after the empty house is gone, shaping how you move through adulthood in ways that often go completely unexamined for decades. You might recognize this pattern in moments like struggling through an entire move by yourself rather than calling a friend, downplaying how exhausted or overwhelmed you actually are when someone close to you checks in, or feeling a strange flicker of guilt when a partner insists on taking care of you while you're genuinely sick. There's often an unspoken belief sitting just underneath this pattern, something close to needing help makes me a burden, and being a burden is dangerous. And that belief was never really about logic in the first place. It was about a child's best possible guess at how to stay emotionally safe in an environment where support wasn't always reliably available. Even compliments or generosity can trigger this same discomfort, leaving you quick to deflect praise or insist on repaying a kindness immediately, simply because receiving without giving something back in return can feel strangely unbalanced. This resistance to needing other people doesn't only make it hard to accept a helping hand, it also quietly closes the door on something even more personal and far harder to access: your own feelings. Sign 4. A tendency to hide what you're really feeling. Many parents raising children in the 1970s had themselves been raised by a generation shaped by the Great Depression and a world war, a generation that often modeled emotional restraint as a kind of quiet virtue, with messages like, "Don't make a fuss," or "There's nothing to cry about," passed down almost without anyone ever intending to teach a deliberate lesson at all. Children absorb these unspoken rules with remarkable speed and accuracy, and if you grew up in this kind of environment, you may have quietly learned that expressing distress was inconvenient at best and a burden at worst, which often leads to a lasting habit of suppressing emotion rather than naming it, sometimes well into your 40s, 50s, or beyond. This can look like automatically answering "I'm fine" after a genuinely brutal week, crying alone in the car for a few minutes before walking inside and acting completely normal in front of your own family, or feeling a strange flash of irritation when someone gently asks how you're really doing, simply because the question itself feels intrusive rather than caring. It isn't that you don't feel things deeply. In many cases, you actually feel things very deeply. It's that somewhere along the way, you learned that the safest place to keep those feelings was tucked quietly inside, rather than spoken out loud where someone else might see them, judge them, or be burdened by them. This often shows up physically, too, as tension headaches, a tight chest, or trouble sleeping, sensations that are really just emotion looking for a way out after being denied a voice for so long. This habit of swallowing your own feelings didn't only shape how you handle your inner emotional life, it also shaped something much bigger: the way you learned to view the people and the systems that were supposed to be looking out for you in the first place. Sign 5. A quiet distrust of authority and big systems. Children growing up in the 1970s came of age against a cultural backdrop that included the Watergate scandal and a sitting president resigning in disgrace on national television, the long, painful aftermath of the Vietnam War, and an oil crisis that brought rationing, gas lines stretching down entire blocks, and a sharp, unsettling rise in everyday prices that touched nearly every family. Even without fully understanding the political or economic details at the time, kids absorbed the emotional undertone of the adult world around them with surprising clarity, and the undertone of that particular decade often carried an implicit message that the people running things, whether in government, in business, or even within your own household, could fail you in ways that genuinely mattered. As an adult, this can quietly show up as a healthy-looking skepticism that's actually rooted in something much deeper: a hesitation to fully trust a new boss's promises about your career, a habit of quietly building backup plans even after being told everything is completely under control, or a low, simmering discomfort whenever you're simply told to trust the process without any further explanation. This skepticism can also extend to large institutions in general: banks, hospitals, schools, or government agencies, leaving you instinctively reading every contract twice and trusting your own research over an expert's reassurance, even when that instinct occasionally exhausts you. You may also notice a quiet resistance to following instructions simply because someone in charge said so, preferring instead to understand the actual reasoning behind a rule before you're willing to fully commit to it, which can look like stubbornness to others, but usually comes from a much older, more protective place inside you. This isn't necessarily cynicism for its own sake. It's a survival strategy your younger self picked up by watching adults and institutions stumble in ways that were impossible to ignore, and that strategy has likely followed you quietly into every workplace, relationship, and system you've had to rely on since.
All of this independence, emotional suppression, and quiet skepticism eventually combined to shape something even larger than any single personality trait on its own, the way your nervous system itself learned to attach to other people. Sign 6, an attachment style built around self-protection. In attachment psychology, the consistency and reliability of caregiving during early childhood plays a major role in shaping how comfortable a person feels with closeness later in life. And the combination of more unsupervised time, rapidly rising divorce rates, and real household financial stress during the 1970s meant that consistency wasn't always something a child could fully count on, even in a loving home. This often produces what's known as an avoidant or anxious avoidant attachment style, where closeness with another person is genuinely wanted on one level, while simultaneously feeling threatening or overwhelming on another, almost as if some part of you is permanently bracing for the moment that closeness eventually disappears. You might notice this pattern in your closest relationships as a tendency to quietly pull away just as things start to feel serious, a sense of being smothered by frequent check-ins or displays of affection that most people would describe as completely normal, or a habit of intellectualizing your emotional needs instead of simply voicing them out loud to the person standing right in front of you. It can also show up as a deep discomfort with conflict, not because you avoid disagreement entirely, but because real vulnerability inside a disagreement, the kind where you admit you're scared of losing someone, feels far riskier than staying calm, logical, and a little distant. This same wiring can also explain why being chosen consistently, a partner who shows up the same way every single day without fail, can sometimes feel oddly more unsettling than reassuring, simply because total predictability was never something your nervous system learned to expect or fully trust. When you put all 6 of these signs together, the comfort with solitude, the reflex toward self-reliance, the discomfort accepting help, the suppressed emotions, the quiet distrust of authority, and an attachment style built around self-protection, what you're really looking at isn't 6 separate, unrelated quirks. It's one coherent psychological strategy, built piece by piece over an entire childhood. A younger version of you built an entire internal operating system for surviving a world that often felt unsupervised, financially uncertain, and short on adult reassurance. And that system worked exactly as it was designed to. It got you through childhood in one piece, but there's a strong chance it's still quietly running in the background of your adult life, in places where it no longer actually serves you the way it once did. Take a moment right now to think about which of these 6 signs felt the most familiar as you were listening, and notice exactly where it tends to show up most clearly, whether that's in your closest relationship, in the way you handle pressure at work, or in the quiet moments when no one else is around to see how you're really coping. Notice, too, whether this pattern has cost you anything, a closeness you wanted but couldn't quite let yourself reach for, or a moment of support you needed but never actually asked for. And try to do this without judgment, simply as honest information about yourself. Ask yourself, too, what it might have felt like as a child to have an adult simply notice, without being asked, that you needed a little extra help, and whether that's a feeling you still secretly long for now, even as a fully capable grown adult. If any part of this resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who grew up in a similar way, whether that's a sibling, an old childhood friend, or even a parent who might finally understand for the very first time exactly why you turned out the way you did. Understanding where a pattern like this came from is only the first step, and there's a closely related question worth exploring next, one that gets right to the heart of what actually happens when someone with this kind of self-protective wiring tries to build a genuinely close, lasting relationship with another person. If that question speaks to you, you'll probably want to watch our video on the psychology of avoidant attachment in relationships, where we break down exactly how this kind of early independence quietly shapes the way adults handle intimacy, and what it actually takes to feel safe enough to let someone fully in without your old defenses taking over. You'll find that video linked at the end of this one and in the description box below, and it picks up almost exactly where this conversation leaves off. Thank you so much for staying with us all the way to the end. It genuinely means a lot, and I hope this gave you a little more clarity about a part of yourself you may have never fully understood before today. If this video helped you see your own story a little differently, please take a second to like it. It makes a real difference in helping this channel reach other people who might need to hear this too. I'd love to know in the comments which of these 6 signs hit closest to home for you, and is there one your friends, siblings, or partner would immediately recognize in you as well? If you want more videos like this one, exploring how childhood quietly shapes the adults we eventually become, go ahead and subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.